Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Spring 2024 Evening Lecture Series. We're delighted to be joined this evening by Curator Emerson Bowyer, who will be speaking about the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova. A reminder to those here on 8th Street to please silence all cell phones during tonight's event. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, you can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the Clayroom for light refreshments and to continue the conversation. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 2023-24 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. Please visit our website to learn more or to make a donation to help keep programs like our Evening Lecture Series free. This evening's lecture in particular is generously supported by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. With their grant, they have also helped us digitize historic lectures from our archives related to European art before 1900. And I invite you to visit our YouTube channel to see some of these really wonderful historic lectures made available thanks to the Kress Foundation. To celebrate this evening's event, please join us for a reception downstairs in the Clayroom following Emerson's talk. Now I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening. Emerson Bowyer is Searle Curator, Painting and Sculpture of Europe at the Art Institute of Chicago. A specialist in 18th and 19th century French and British art, he has previously worked at the Frick Collection, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His exhibitions include David d'Angers, Making the Modern Monument at the Frick in 2013, and Like Life, Sculpture, Color, and the Body at the Met Breuer in 2018. The Art Institute is currently presenting two exhibitions co-conceived by Breuer: Canova, Sketching in Clay, which is open through March 18th, and Camille Claudel, which is traveling from the Institute to the Getty, where it will be on view from April 2nd to July 21st. Now please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Emerson.
Good evening. It's so great to be here tonight, especially amongst artists, to chat about the sculptor Antonio Canova and the exhibition Canova Sketching in Clay, currently on view at the Art Institute in Chicago and co-organized with the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Canova Sketching in Clay is the largest American exhibition ever devoted to the celebrated Italian sculptor and focuses primarily on process. How do you create a marble sculpture? How do you move from an initial idea to a finished work of art? Here are a few images of the installation in Chicago. I don't think I've ever been quite so pleased with the installation of an exhibition. With lavish space in our Regenstein exhibition galleries, the sculptures are almost all visible in the round and have space to breathe. We wanted to evoke a contemporary classicism which would complement the works and emphasize their freshness and modernity. The show is up until March 18, so if you find yourself in Chicago, please stop by. Now, in the years around 1800, Antonio Canova was hands down the most celebrated artist in Europe. Until his death in Venice in 1822, the rich and powerful of Europe, and even the United States, clamored to own examples of his virtuosity. The leading proponent of neoclassicism, that art movement that emulated the pure and idealized forms of Greek and Roman antiquity, Canova remains famous today for his exquisitely finished marble statues, such as here, Psyche revived by Cupid's kiss at the Louvre, Now, Canova's friend Leopoldo Cicognara described his carving process as a sensuous series of kisses and caresses as he worked to wear down a marble block to reveal a figure. But works like that, and here, the Three Graces, did not miraculously emerge fully formed in marble. They began as small and loosely modeled sketches where the artist raced to materialize his ideas in soft, damp clay. These intimate sculptures are more than just a step in the process of making a work of art. They are works of art in their own right. These vivid works bear the traces of the artist's fingers as he pressed and pinched the material, as well as the gouging and scraping of his tools. Often produced in less than an hour, these sometimes almost frenzied sculptures crackle with energy. Clay sketches were increasingly prized by collectors during the 18th century. In 1769, for example, the German archaeologist and art historian Winkelmann argued that for sculptors, sketching in clay is like drawing on paper for a painter. And as the juice from the first pressing of grapes makes the best wine, so the genius of an artist is displayed in all its naturalness and truth in works in soft material or on paper. In other words, sketches provided the most direct evidence of the artist's hand. Other works in clay by Canova were more carefully produced and served as models for finished marble sculptures. And here you see a work from the exhibition, one of his more finished models for the head of the Medusa from a sculpture you're probably familiar with from a very central space in the Metropolitan Museum, as well as another version, of course, at the Vatican in Rome. Now, I hardly need to tell you this, but clay is a natural material formed by the decomposition of different kinds of rock. When mixed with water, it becomes a thick, malleable substance that can be shaped easily by hands and tools. It has been used to make sculptures for millennia. Unlike marble carving, in which stone is subtracted from a larger block, sculpting in clay is an additive process in which lumps of the soft material can be pressed together to create forms. Inexpensive and easy to manipulate, clay was an ideal material for sculptors like Canova to develop their compositional ideas. Although he had to work quickly, the substance becomes increasingly fragile and brittle as it dries out. Firing the finished model by exposing it to extreme heat in a kiln hardens it into a more durable terracotta. Here you can see stills from a remarkable video we produced with the Vermont-based sculptor Fred X. Brownstein. We searched for quite a while to find somebody in the States who was capable of reproducing as closely as possible Canova's process, his entire process, from a beginning quick sketch all the way through to a plaster cast of a model, and from that pointed plaster to a finished marble. And it was surprisingly difficult to find, a number of people who were familiar with all of the techniques that Canova would have used in his lifetime and were able to do every step in the process. So we commissioned Fred to produce ultimately a marble version of the top third of one of Canova's most famous compositions called the Venus Italica. It was commissioned by the Vatican soon after Napoleon looted the Venus de Medici and took it back to Paris. And so the idea was that Canova's sculpture would replace the great antiquity in the Louvre, in the Vatican, and be seen in the same place. We had cameras in Fred's studio for about 4 months earlier this year, and earlier last year, and I simply cannot believe that he allowed this kind of intrusion into his studio. And we had hundreds of hours of footage, and they were put together into a series of 3 short videos that allowed you to follow initially what you see here, the sketching process, and then the creation of a larger and more finished model in clay, and then the taking of a plaster cast. From that plaster cast, then the transfer of the composition into marble. And it's been an extraordinary to see people, clamoring around these videos in the exhibition because, and I'm sure that you know as well as I do, that describing the sculptural process can be very, very difficult. There aren't necessarily words that can fully explain how it goes. I mean, most people know how a painting is made generally, for example, but sculpture is a lot more technical, and involves a number of different complex processes. So we figured we would just show people. We don't have any words in the video. We only have the ambient sounds of the studio work itself. And that's now been posted online, so you can find it on the museum website. Although only around 60 works in clay by Canova survive today, he must have made hundreds of clay sketches and models over the course of his career. Many would have been discarded, thrown back in a bucket for the clay to be reused, and others must have fallen victim to the uncertainties of the firing process. This extraordinary bust here demonstrates the difficulties of that process. It would have begun as a heap of moist clay dug out of a bin in Canova's studio and piled onto his modeling stand to create the rough forms of shoulders, neck, and head. Using his hands and tools, Canova added and removed clay, shaped it, smoothed it, and inscribed its surface to gradually refine the figure. Last, he applied rolled, spaghetti-like strands of clay to the boy's scalp to produce his springy curls. The network of deep cracks that penetrate the surface of the bust are not structural, but occurred during the firing process. The clay mustn't have dried sufficiently before being placed in the kiln. Although unintended by the artist, I think the cracks underscore the fleeting nature of youth, which is embodied in the figure. And, I like to think that this is the kind of object that emerged damaged from the kiln, and Canova in other circumstances might have discarded the object. But I like to think that he, looking at this work with its new, crack, network of cracks across the surface, realized that this somehow enhanced the aesthetics of the composition itself. Canova's clay sketches were never publicly exhibited or commercially marketed during his lifetime. They were only partially accessible to visitors in a more private section of his studio. And here is a kind of make-believe imagining of Canova's studio that was done a few decades after his death by an Italian painter. And it does give you a sense, though, of the kind of objects that you would have seen in his studio. There was a large central space in the Roman studio where visitors were frequently going in and out. It was one of the stops on the grand tour for anybody that was going to Rome to look at antiquities. You also went to Canova's studio to see contemporary art being made. And then, of course, once seeing things in the studio, you would, commission him to make something special just for you. And you can see here a large-scale, life-size, larger than life-size, clay model for one of his marble tomb monuments. You see plasters in the background and a few terracotta sketches, models, up on the shelf behind. This isn't exactly how it would have been in his studio. There was a second smaller space in the studio, which was only partially accessible to people who were closer to the artist and given more privileged access. And it's in that space that you would have found his terracotta sketches and models, as well as portfolios of, numerous portfolios of his drawings. The sketches were perhaps relics for the artist of pleasurable moments working with the medium. Also, perhaps, they would be used by him as a repertoire of compositions to be consulted, a kind of memory book in a way. Mostly, I suspect, they were deeply valued by him for their appearance as aesthetic objects in their own right. Most of them remained in his studio when he died. The few that escaped the studio were given as gifts by the artist to close friends and patrons. And here you see one of the most beautiful of his sketches. It's a preliminary sketch for the Three Graces. It was given as a gift to the greatest society beauty of her day, Juliette Recamier. Here you see her portrait by Jacques-Louis David. And, you know, I like to think that Canova very knowingly gave this particular composition to Madame Recamier, precisely because I think he wanted to associate her with the idea of grace. Now, of the 60 or so surviving works in clay by Canova, our exhibition gathers over half of them. The majority have traveled from the Artists' Museum in Pusano in Italy. And this is the artist's hometown. He returned to Venice some few years before his death. And this was the very first museum that was built especially to house the works or be dedicated to the work of one single artist. It opened about 6 years after he died. He was very much involved in it, and it's very interesting to see, to think about this, of the origin of all those single artist museums that are around this country and around the world today. And so this would have opened around 1828, much earlier than the others that we're used to. And this is on the left is the original space. All the works that were left in his studio were transferred to his museum, and they largely consisted of his plasters. And at the time, the plasters were highly valued by audiences, and so they were very prominently displayed in the museum. The sketches were in a sort of less accessible space, easily overlooked by visitors, and so they weren't really seen very much. And that's because at that time, in the couple of decades after Canova's death, it was the plasters that people thought best represented the artist and his oeuvre. However, toward the end of the 19th century, visitors to the museum started to write in journals and letters and other things that they were taking much more notice of the terracottas. And I think that's because, in the late 19th, early 20th century, people started to find the expressive, unfinished qualities of the terracottas more engaging, more interesting, and again, as giving them a sense of being much closer to the artist and his hand. In the 1950s, representing this shift in the value of certain works in the museum, the great modernist Italian architect Carlo Scarpa was commissioned to do an addition to the Canova Museum in Pusano. It was his first museum project, and this is part of it, and you see it right here. And you can see that it was specifically designed to feature the terracottas. So I think it just gives you, in a way, a sort of short history of the history of taste when it comes to Canova's works. Now, our teams from Chicago and the National Gallery spent a lot of time here analyzing the works very carefully. As you can imagine, works in clay are extremely fragile, and the thought of traveling them around the world was terrifying, and I had many nights of nightmares leading up to the installation of the show. In fact, every time they opened a crate, I had to go in another room, and I would wait for a conservator to go like this to make sure nothing had broken in transit. But here you see Tony Siegel, who is perhaps the greatest expert on historical terracottas and techniques, who at the time was the objects conservator at the Harvard Museums, and then Daphne, who is the objects curator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And we spent multiple weeks here, and we went through each object one at a time, and they wrote whole reports on every single object, and we allowed the conservators to tell us which objects they believed were fit for travel. There were a number of works that we didn't borrow purely because we feared that they wouldn't make the journey. Some of them we discovered had what many of you are aware of, I'm sure, blind cracks, so cracks inside that you can't necessarily see, and from the outside, and things like that. And also there are a couple of works in the Canova Museum that are terra cruda, so they're unfired clay. And the last thing we wanted to do was even get within 5 meters of those. So we were very, I felt very careful about what we brought, what we decided to borrow from the museum. And then the rest of the works came from other museums around Italy, a number in the Veneto, because of the Veneto region's closeness to Canova, the Vatican, and then a number of English museums and private collections, because many of the sketches that were given as gifts by Canova went to his British patrons precisely because the British were such a large part of his patronage circle. So Canova was the son of a stonecutter from Pusano in Italy. And you can see here that it is about an hour and a half northwest of Venice. He apprenticed under the sculptor Giuseppe Bernardi, beginning at the age of 13. He later followed Bernardi to Venice, where he created his first independent works. The works that survive from this period are highly finished and serve particular purposes, and I think the reason they survived, you'll realize in a minute. This is one of the earliest works, 1775. It is a copy he made in clay after the very famous antiquity, The Wrestlers. He copied it from a plaster that was in a private collection in Venice at the time. And you can see how highly finished the work is. And it was because it was for a competition. He also gave it a white slip, I think, to imitate marble, the appearance of marble. And given the extreme technical prowess that we're seeing here, it's kind of shocking to me that he only got second place in the competition. I'm not quite sure what could have been better. And then the other very early work that survives is his own composition of a standing figure of Apollo. And this was his acceptance piece for entry into the Venetian Academy of Art. So just, a couple of years after The Wrestlers that we just saw. And so the reason they survive and the reason they were kept is because they were important for competition reasons, for, entrance to the Academy. And that's why this work is in the Accademia in Venice, because they would have taken it straight away after he gave it to them as his reception piece. There is another early work which is in the show. It's dated from 1 year before he moves to Rome, definitively. And this is an extraordinary bust-length portrait of Doge Paolo Regnier. Now, this was the last Venetian Doge. The title was, and the position was gotten rid of once we got into the Napoleonic Wars. It was commissioned by the Doge's friend, who was a senator in Venice, who wanted a portrait of his friend, the Doge. And Canova produced this extraordinarily naturalistic bust where he's utterly showing off at the same time. You can see the hyper-realism of the fur in the figure's cape here, the embroidery on his hat, the wrinkles in the face, the real sense you get of the fact that he's wearing a wig. There's nothing neoclassical about this. This is before Canova really becomes the neoclassicist that we know and remember. He's really sort of working in a sort of a previous, older style, a more current style when he's working on this. It's a work that had a complicated history because the Doge and the senator who commissioned the work, they quickly fell out of friendship because the Doge wouldn't do the senator political favors. So one night in a fury, the senator picked it up, took it outside and threw it on the ground. And of course it smashed into many pieces. He instructed his servants to pee on it, as, never upset an Italian. And thankfully, somebody recovered the pieces, and it's been lovingly restored, and it's thankfully still with us today. So in 17, around almost a few months after he finishes that bust, he moves to Rome. And you can just imagine this young guy from Venice getting into what was then the capital of Europe, basically, especially for art. And, he's suddenly able to see not just all the great antiquities from ancient Rome, but, also previous works from previous, the stars of sculpture of the past, people like Bernini, and to see what was going on in contemporary art. He describes in his journal at the time that he sketches in clay every day, then he goes back to his apartment at night and keeps modeling in clay by candlelight. And he describes in vivid detail the sort of the hazards of working in clay and traveling between a studio and his apartment. The day he accidentally, left one of his clay models, in a carriage. The day he tripped on the stairs going up to his apartment and something fell and broke. It's wonderful to sort of hear directly from him about the utterly everyday occurrences of working in this medium. This is one of the first works, we think, that he produced when he arrived in Rome. He says in his journal that he went up to the Accademia in Rome one day where they had set up a model as Christ on the crucifix, and everyone was sitting around it, and he said, I sketched it on paper, and then I modeled it in clay. And then we think this is that work. And it looks a little highly finished for something that you would just do sketching from life. I suspect that it was taken home that evening and worked on subsequently after that, kept damp overnight, etc. It is about this big. But you can see here as well that he's harking back to an earlier style. There's something very Baroque about this. There's nothing particularly neoclassical about it. So everybody was shocked in Rome when this young and unproven sculptor received an important commission for a funerary monument for Pope Clement XIV in the Roman Church of Santi Apostoli. He'd only been in Rome for a couple of years when he got this. And you can imagine that at the time, the height of ambition for any sculptor or any artist was to receive a papal commission. The work itself is colossal. The door that you see at the bottom there is far higher than a human being. So you can imagine just how tall the figures are in real life. The critical success of this monument led to a stream of new commissions that would continue unabated for the rest of his career. We have sketches for a number of parts of this sculpture. And it's so wonderful to see the thought process behind their development. You can see that some of them look vastly different to how the works turned out. Others don't, for various reasons. This, for example, is a very, very quick sketch for one of the seated figures. It's about this big in real life. It was probably made in less than 20 minutes. And yet look at the emotion he is able to give to this frantically modeled little piece. This, on the other hand, a work about this big, is highly finished. It's been given a white slip to look more like marble. And this is what we would call a presentation piece. So this is what Canova took to the papal commissioners and said, this is what this figure is going to look like, so that they could give approval so that he could start carving in the marble. And what's also wonderful about this piece is not just its beauty, but the fact that it is very, very visually a studio tool. There are pencil crosses all over it giving measurements. There are numbered measurements around the side. So this was something that, yes, was presented at one point and then used very heavily in the studio in order to start enlarging to larger dimensions. This is another one of the works. This is one of the most beautiful finished works in terracotta I've ever seen. It's about this big. When I first saw it, it looked like carved wood. It's still in the family to which Canova gave it as a gift in the 18 teens. I waited 2 years to be allowed into the castle of the family who has this piece, and I thought I'd be taken into some grand hall where it would be sort of on display on a pedestal in the center. But no, they took me down to the kitchen where it was when it was sitting on a coaster, and I couldn't believe it. Unbelievable. This, I mean, it is the way that he has achieved on such a small scale, the folds of the drapery, the utter mysterious quality of this figure, and the way that it's a little hard to see in this angle. Again, you all know this. You have to walk around these objects to get a clear sense of them. The way that the drapery clings to her body in a way that you can see her entire form. It's incredible. Now, some of Canova's surviving sketches afford us a window into his thought processes, and I want to show two examples of this. Here on the right is his first surviving or earliest surviving sketch for the Three Graces. Now, when he decided he was going to do the Three Graces, it was a commission from Josephine Bonaparte. He would have known this format or this iconography for the Three Graces. This one example of thousands is currently in the Metropolitan Museum. And you can see how each of the women is a repetition. They look exactly the same. And you have this front, back, or back, front, back rhythm. And it is the same throughout antiquity. That is just how the Three Graces were shown. And what it does is it gives you a sense of flatness and of linearity. Canova, from his very first sketch on the same subject, wants to do something utterly different. The figures, for starters, are at completely different heights. One of them has turned right around to sort of create an almost circle of figures dancing around to the music of Apollo's lyre, and they look in towards each other. They're engaging with each other. This is him taking antiquity and doing something entirely different with it. Then he progresses to a much more developed sketch, almost on the cusp of being a model rather than a sketch, where he sort of brings the figures back out again as sort of bookends to the central figure. He still maintains the different heights, And, I love their long, mannerist bodies. They're almost like nudes from paintings from the school of Fontainebleau. And then the sort of ways in which these arms are sort of seemingly haphazardly, but not at all, interconnected with each other. And then that is only echoed by the sort of the slim ribbon that seems to move between them and tie them together. The other pair I wanted to talk about in terms of us understanding Canova's thought process is this pair. They are sketches for a work that was never produced in marble, so I don't know why. I mean, maybe he was just thinking of this composition one day. We haven't read of any commission for it. And it's a fairly obscure subject matter for us. It's Pyrrhus sacrificing Polyxena. Now, Polyxena was a Trojan princess, and this scene takes place at the end of the Trojan War. And here, Pyrrhus is the son of Achilles. And Achilles' vengeful ghost comes to him and says, you must avenge me. You need to kill the daughter of the Trojan king. And so, he drags her onto his father's tomb, just to, make it even clearer. And she, being very brave, offers him her neck and her breast and says, well, you choose, where you're going to do it. And Canova presents two very different ways of depicting this scene, and I just love that. It's one of the few moments in the terracottas where we were able to make these kind of comparisons. On the left, he's chosen the actual moment of murder, and you see the figure with his arm raised, dagger in his hand, about to thrust it down towards her body. And it's one of those truly exciting terracottas where just covered in fingerprints. And then the second work is very, very different. It's still the moment before he commits the murder, but you can see that his body is while tense, the dagger is down at his side, he's looking down at her, and he's contemplating the act that he's been asked to perform. This is a much more cerebral accounting of the moment. This is much more about one's conscience and the struggles of morality. Now, personally, I think this is the more successful of the two compositions, because it asks us to think about something much more than simply physical bodily movement and the simple act of killing. Now, after Canova had finished his first monument, the tomb to Clement XIV, the number of commissions increased dramatically. And he grew to have this gigantic workshop. I mean, there were tens and tens of people working for him at any given time. We often like to think that these artists are sort of just working completely alone in the studio. I mean, when you're making marbles on this scale and taking many, many orders every day, there's simply no way to do it. Here is one of the few surviving images of the interior of his Roman studio. And you can see here a number of people, engaged in different activities, maybe mixing plaster, pointing nails into plasters. You can see the frames from which plumb lines would dangle over the top of two figures on the side, one in plaster, perhaps the other one in marble. And specific roles would have been assigned to different people. So one person, if there would be people who specialized in the production of plaster, there would be people who specialized in the cleaning of dust off the marbles, all these kinds of activities. But Canova was, I guess, like the captain of the ship. He was there constantly, overseeing everything that went on, but he was very much physically present in terms of his hands at the beginning of the process when working in clay, and then at the end of the process when he came in and delivered, the months-long final polishing and finishing of the marble sculpture. Of course, many more steps lay between Canova's first efforts to design a sculpture in clay and its realization in marble. Among his numerous challenges was how to move from small to large, from a small sketch or model to a monumental statue. His solution was to rely on measuring tools and a mechanical process called pointing. As though he had a 3D printer at his disposal, he could reproduce a model at a larger size by taking repeated measurements from it and proportionally enlarging them. This involved combinations of calipers, plumb lines, and metal pointing marks, black dots that served as fixed points for measuring, which appear on many of his surviving plasters. And you can see one there, second from the right. Now, almost all previous sculptors had moved fairly directly from a small-scale model to the working on what would become the finished marble. And they would just simply proportionally enlarge directly from the smaller piece to the marble itself. Canova was completely different. And this is one incredible innovation of his. He would gradually enlarge the composition over multiple finished clay models. So, in other words, he would make a series of clay models that would keep getting larger and larger and larger until he reached the exact scale of what the marble was going to be. So you can imagine the colossal scale of a clay model that he would have to get to, like life size for something like this. Because those clay models were so large, armatures were of course needed to keep the clay from breaking, from sinking and parts breaking off. These internal structures and their very size meant that the works couldn't be fired. So plaster casts were made of those, and it's the plaster casts that were then used to transfer to marble. And in the process of taking that plaster cast, the clay itself is necessarily destroyed. So in a way, the first positive from your mold in plaster becomes, in a sense, the new original that he's working with. This series of increasingly large clay models for a composition drew out the creative process over a much longer period of time. And I think that's significant because it allowed Canova to, over a protracted period of time, make continual changes at each level of, or each scaled example of the model. So to make changes to the composition as necessary and over the course of these multiple models. You see another example here. This is the great portrait of Napoleon's mother, Laetitia Bonaparte, Madame Mère. And again, you see, and we have this in the exhibition, you go from a number of sketches. This is a mid-sized plaster model here, so it's about that high. The marble, there is a life-size marble as well that is pointed, and then this is the finished marble here. We're really excited to have this marble in the show. It was commissioned by Napoleon's mother. She visited Canova's studio in Rome in 1804, and she must have been quite a piece of work. She commissioned it for herself, and Canova spent a few years getting it made. And then it was shipped to Paris, where it drew great acclaim. And she went up to her son afterwards and she said, "Well, Napoleon, I know exactly where this is going to go." And he said, well, where, Mum? And she said, "Directly opposite your throne in the Palace of the Tuileries." And I think, not wanting Mum looking over his shoulder the whole time, he said, "Bugger off," and put it into storage where it remained. And in 1818, after the fall of Napoleon, there was kind of a Napoleonic fire sale because nobody wanted any of this Napoleonic stuff anymore. And the Duke of Devonshire, who was a great admirer of Canova and owned a number of works by Canova, he bought it. And Laetitia was furious because not only was it being sold off, but it was going to the English. And it's been in Chatsworth ever since. And so this is the first time it's left. And it's truly, truly spectacular to have it in the US right now. This is another extraordinary marble that's in the exhibition. It's come from all the way from Genoa. Now, Canova's full-scale clay models were always cast in plaster. The artist routinely used this relatively expensive material to make casts of his clay sketches and models. Plaster casts allowed him to preserve his clay compositions in a form durable enough to survive frequent handling in his studio, where they were shown to visitors and clients, copied and used as models for his marbles. This top half of the Magdalene, you see the pointing marks in it, so this would have been used for the transfer into marble. And it's extraordinary the way these pointing marks, while being purely a sort of technical part of the process, start to have their own aesthetic effects. And there's a way in which this only adds to the sense of objection of the repentant Magdalene that we see in the finished marble. Canova's entire process might be called one of refinement. Take the Cupid and Psyche, for example. It began as a swiftly and roughly modeled sketch in clay. There is such animation here. The figures are locked in a seemingly violent struggle with the woman here as the aggressor. I love the arm movement of the male figure, bent and pushing against her shoulder, and his head sort of moving off in the opposite direction. And Canova sort of finished the sketch by raking it all over with a toothed tool, which to me only adds these sort of extraordinary vectors of movement that only enhance the liveliness of the composition. Compare this with the finished marble, though. I mean, there's the entire sentiment of the sculpture has changed, the entire concept. From figures who are almost who are struggling against each other in a way, to these figures who are locked in this utterly sensual, elegant, and refined embrace. And this is what you see over and over again in the course of Canova's creative process. The initial getting down of an idea is sort of fiery and emotive, and then that is all sort of distilled and distilled and distilled until he gets to the final product. You can see it again here, I think. This little initial sketch for the penitent Magdalene, she's about this big. He would have done it in less than 20 minutes. And you can see the idea was already there. And it for me, perhaps works or is more emotive than the finished marble, because there's something so apt about the depiction of this composition of this abject woman on the ground made of earth herself, and you feel the very weight of her arms upon her thighs. There's something so affecting, I think, about this little sketch in clay. Unlike his clay sketches, Canova's marbles take refinement to its technical and conceptual limit. In works such as his life-size portrait of Napoleon's mother, the surface of the marble varies greatly as the eye passes over it. And this is, again, what was utterly peculiar about Canova and marble. Most sculptors of the period, when they sculpted a figure, it had the same finish the whole way over. Drapery, flesh, hair, didn't matter. Canova would spend so much time carving every different section of the work to have a completely different texture. And that's what makes a Canova. And that's why he was celebrated so much in his lifetime. But it's also why he was criticized for a number of people. Because when you start to use textures, such an array of different textures, to enhance the lifelikeness of the sculptures, a lot of critics found these things too sensual, too like life, and not sort of removed from the world into a purely aesthetic plane in the way that they thought sculpture should be. Here's just to give you a sense of how the textures can vary so dramatically on the surface of a single marble by Canova. And just to make clear, his studio assistants would carve almost the entire figure for him. They would leave a few millimeters at the end that they called the skin. And it's the skin that Canova comes in and then manipulates with his tools for months and months on end. It's a very fetishistic process. When you look at these marbles, there's something sort of strange about it, because when it's a finished work, you expect that you're going to take the whole work in its entirety. Like something like this. But when you get in front of it, you start getting drawn ever and ever closer to the surface, and you start to not see the overall composition anymore, because you start to get sort of drawn into these individual different textures. So in a way, you start to lose the wholeness of the composition with a Canova marble. And that's in a way where the sort of fetishism comes in, not just on Canova's part, but on the viewer's part. As opposed to the terracottas, the clay sketches, where they're very unfinished, seems to somehow compel you to complete them in your mind. So they are expansive in a way in which the marbles seem to actually move in the other direction, in a way. Clay and marble were the alpha and the omega of Canova's practice. They represented, respectively, idea and execution, beginning and end. Even so, the finished marbles retain something of the memory of Clay's manipulability. In his pursuit of pliability in marble, in his desire for stone to become living flesh, Canova seemingly translated the defining quality of one medium into another. We find perhaps an understanding of this intent in Cicognara's provocative description of Canova kissing and caressing his marbles into existence, rather than chipping or carving, imprinting his own body onto the stone, pressing against it to create form. From this vantage point, clay was never simply a technically expedient medium for Canova. On the contrary, clay carried a poetic and conceptual charge that suffused his entire practice with its sensuous qualities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emerson. An incredible look at an artist's process from start to finish, really. So I welcome anyone in the room here on 8th Street to raise your hand. If you have a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. And for our online audience, please feel free to type in your question into the Q&A. Do we have a question in the room? Yes.
Hello, Emerson. It's so lovely to see you, and welcome back to New York. My question is, and I missed the beginning of the lecture, so forgive me if it's a repetition, but tell us about the models, because his proportions of the body and expressions are so beautiful and so genuine.
Oh, the real models? Like the living people? You know, it's interesting. He would absolutely have used models for portraiture because he needed to get the likeness of the face. I suspect that he did work from living models, but I think that he also evolved to the point where he was able to sort of work without them, and not all the time. There are a number of compositions here where you just think that these are coming purely just from his mind, and he's just racing to get them down, and because their proportions are all weird, and then maybe perhaps after an initial quick sketch, maybe he did have a live model sort of stand there, and then he would adapt via looking at a real body, and then of course, even if he did do that, he then, as a good neoclassicist, totally idealizes whatever body he's been looking at in the service of this kind of pure perfection of form and an emphasis on, the aesthetics of linearity and things like that. And that's why Canova is really a complex character, because on the one hand, he's a good neoclassicist and a pioneering and the leading neoclassicist. But on the other hand, there's his quest for, a very subversive life-likeness, sort of masquerading as based on the Greek and Roman antiquity. And so there is a deeply sensual quality to Canova as well. So they're kind of, he's much more complex than other sculptors at the time, I think, who were either just trying to do antiquity or trying to make antiquity their own via reality, I think.
Thank you.
Sure, I came late. And is there possible we see all these nice comparison of the sketches and the artwork somewhere from your lecture online or something? Because I was unlucky to come late for a reason. It's very nice comparison. I'm a teacher of arts, but mainly I'm focused in painting. But I have done some sculpture as well.
Yes, I think the images will all be accessible, and there are a number of images of the works on the website at the Art Institute of Chicago for the exhibition that's up right now.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries.
Emerson, you mentioned portfolios of drawings, and I wonder if you could speak to the relationship of drawing to these sketches, to the final marble.
It's a really good question. In a way, I've been pretty artificial by leaving out the drawings. Canova was an obsessive draftsman. He was sketching all the time. He had sketchbooks with him when he went around, and the majority of those hundreds of drawings are all kept at a small museum in the Veneto in Bassano del Grappa. And we wanted initially to include the drawings as well in the exhibition, but because of the peculiar conservation problems of works on paper, they could only be shown 3 months at a time. And so we would have had to have had two completely different groups of drawings, one for Washington, one for and Chicago, and it was getting a little too complicated. But to answer your real question, I think drawing and sketching in clay were inseparable for Canova. And to begin with, I was sort of thinking I'd be able to work out if drawings came before sketches, as you sort of, drawings before clay sketches. You sort of think of that as being somehow logical, but I really don't think that's how it worked. I think he was moving between the media simultaneously, and there are things that you can do quickly on paper that you can't do in clay as easily. And also you can be traveling on a cart and suddenly, whip out your sketchbook and say, oh, that idea. You can't do that with clay necessarily. But working in paper can't give you the same sense of three-dimensionality, the ability to sort of turn a piece around and start looking at how it looks from every different angle. So I think both media were working together and at the same time for him in his process.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did Canova or the museum keep molds as well?
He didn't keep his molds. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I wonder if they felt like once the museum was in progress of being built and opened, if they felt that there was no need for them because they had existing plasters of everything already, and there are multiple versions of multiple plasters for various objects. I mean, I wonder also if they were worried about, contraband copies and things like that. I mean, there are often commissioners of compositions who would try to say to sculptors, mine is the only one that can be made. And sculptors always tried to get around that because that was not economically viable for them.
And the terracottas that are known to have survived to his death, they were destroyed by the museum?
They were, sorry?
Destroyed or dispersed by the museum?
No. I think when he died, the 60 that we know of were the only ones left in existence. I think that he kept only the special ones. Yeah.
And is he known to have had a kiln?
He must have. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it would have been on an industrial scale, and that's why the only terracottas we see, they don't go above this height. After that, he starts making plaster casts.
Is there anything like a plot plan of that studio in Rome, or of the small room in the Veneto?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
There is one historical, plan of the floor plan that shows the larger room, the smaller room.
And any kind of catalog of the contents at his death, of stuff other than sculpture?
No, I mean there is, I don't think there is a will and testament, and it sort of changed over time, and it sort of tells, in it, it doesn't give a whole accounting of everything that Canova has or everything in the studio. What it does have are certain requests for certain friends to receive certain terracottas as gifts. No, it would have been interesting to see if there was a difference between, before and after death.
And you can't track them down. I mean, that trail goes cold of the individuals who were given things?
Well, we know of most of them now. It's very rarely that a sketch emerges that we didn't already know of. There's a clay sketch that was discovered last year, and it's on the market right now. And I've spent a little bit of time with it, but I'd love to spend a lot more time with it. You start to, and that work doesn't have any known provenance, so we can't trace it back to a gift that was given. So then you have to attribute it purely on style, and it is interesting because the longer I spent with Canova, the more his signature moves start to stand out in his works. He had his own sort of abbreviated visual vocabulary when he was working quickly in clay, because he's working just for himself, So there's this particular way he does eyes. He sort of stabs in with a tool, twists it, clockwise, and that's his eye. I mean, he'll do one swipe down the back for a spine, for chests, particularly male chests. He'll have sort of cruciform lines that he'll just, put straight into the surface. And it's just all for him. And what's also remarkable is even sometimes with the smallest and most abbreviated of strokes, you still have incredible sense of exactly what he's thinking of when he's doing it. And that, I think, is one of his great skills.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Were any armatures ever discovered of the working base?
No, I suspect they were often reused. Once you sort of pull it all out of the plaster mold, you'd sort of strip the clay to use it again because it would still be fairly damp. And then you could reuse the wooden and metal armature. Yeah.
Did he sign his sketches
No.
in clay? Mm-hmm. So it's all just, your expertise of studying his mark.
And knowing the provenance of many of them. I mean,
Sure.
the ones that are in the Possagno Museum, we know they're by Canova because they were in his studio when he died. Mm-hmm. And then we do have this sort of documents for a number of works saying that they were given as gifts to. There were a couple where he's sort of inscribed a little thing here and there. The sketch that was given to Madame Camille, he's written while it was still wet. He wrote in the base of it, but yeah, it's a mix of mostly provenance because they're fairly well documented because there aren't that many of them, and they were prized from the moment they were given to the people they were given to, and then connoisseurship.
Of course, well, and to sign it implies that it's, a finished work, but if he's seeing them
it's really interesting. I about 10 years ago was working on another artist who actually met Canova. He was as a young student in France. He got the Prix de Rome, and he went over to Rome, and specifically because he wanted to meet Canova. And his teacher, Jacques-Louis David, wrote a letter to him saying, "Well, All right. Well, I guess you can go and visit Canova, but don't be seduced by his work. Which is so tells you a lot about Jacques-Louis David as well. But anyway, this artist later on he writes. There's a letter he writes to a friend of his, and it accompanies a box with a clay sketch in it that he's made. And he says to his friend, please don't show this sketch to anybody else. It's only a manuscript, and there are a few people who know how to understand it. And I think Canova would have felt much the same about his sketches. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emerson. I think we've all been seduced.